There never is a dull moment in the contemporary Middle East. Joining me today to discuss some of the implications of the Chinese backed rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran is one of the world's foremost scholars on the Saudi state and political Islam. He's a professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University and also the director of the Institute of the Transregional Study of the Contemporary Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Professor Bernard Haykel, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your time.
It's a real pleasure to be back to be with you, Ishan. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Haeckel, let's just start with the elephant in the room. There's been a lot of talk about this being the end of Pax Americana in West Asia, the US in decline, in retreat, China emerging as a peer competitor in this region. Is this a point of concern for you? What do you think?
Um, no, not really. It's not a point of concern. I think let's begin like with the bigger, more historical picture.
Right.
The United States has been engaged for the last 23 or 24 years in the Middle East in a way that has been self-defeating, beginning with the war on terror and the way that was waged, the invasion of Iraq, then the Obama administration's, about turn, deciding that it wants to, leave Iraq and pivot to Asia and its support for the Muslim Brotherhood, and then its support for a nuclear agreement, which has now failed with Iran. All of these have led the principal states in the Middle East, and also the principal allies of the Middle East. And here I include Saudi Arabia, Israel, uh, Egypt to some extent, and Turkey, to diversify their relationships around the world and to look to a world in which the United States is no longer very present in the Middle East. And that's the will and desire of successive American administrations, both Democrat and Republican. So they are hedging. Now, it is true that the United States is still the dominant military power in the region. It's also the dominant power when it comes to attracting investments from the Middle East. That is not going to be replaced. That in those two respects, it's not going to be replaced by China anytime soon. China doesn't force projection, doesn't have the aircraft carriers, the bases, and so on that the United States has. But the region's actors, for different reasons, are not happy with the United States and are looking to protect themselves by building very strong relations, particularly with China, but also with Russia.
Right. Now, if we look at uh, sort of zero in on the Saudis and also look at what's happened during the Biden presidency, the relationship has been somewhat fractious, and there have been attempts before in Baghdad and Muscat to try and bring Saudi and Iran to the negotiating table. What does China bring to this equation that has brought about this change? Is it something that is Saudi specific, something to do with Mohammed bin Salman and how he sees the world now? I mean, this has come in the backdrop of other changes as well. We see the reintegration of Syria into the Arab world. A part of this is also negotiations in Yemen. So it almost seems like
Yeah.
a paradigm shift on the part of Mohammed bin Salman. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, there are two questions here. One is about Biden, and one is about
Right.
Mohammed bin Salman and China and Iran. So, on the uh, question of President Biden and his relationship with Saudi Arabia, President Biden came with the more or less the same team that had been around President Obama, and he had said very aggressive and insulting things about the Saudis during the presidential campaign, and then followed up immediately as soon as he came to office with a CIA document that alleges that Mohammed bin Salman may or may not have been involved in the Khashoggi murder. So, uh, and also President Biden came in surrounded by people who were very sort of deeply invested in the question of climate and climate change, and in transitioning away from fossil fuels to alternative sources of energy, clean sources of energy. And he also had a kind of left wing of the Democratic Party that had been extremely upset with the Saudis for having a close relationship with President Trump and his son-in-law. So for all these reasons, the Biden administration essentially discounted Saudi Arabia and really didn't treat it as a strategic ally. The chickens came home to roost in that, the energy transition is going to take much longer. It's very complicated. Once the Russians actually, even before the Russians invaded Ukraine, there wasn't enough supply after the COVID pandemic receded. There was a huge demand for oil. Prices started going up at the pump in the United States, and he sent out an emissary, President Biden, to MBS asking for more oil, to which MBS told them they could take a flying jump, and didn't respond to that. Then Biden in last July in 2022 went again to Saudi Arabia asking for more oil, again with the idea that the American consumer is upset at the price of oil at the pump, and with the view that the midterm elections might be very damaging to the Democrats because of the price of oil. So the relationship with Saudi Arabia has been quite negative, and then super demanding of the Saudis trying to help out the Biden administration. And that hasn't been appreciated at all by the Saudis. But I think that when the Saudis think about the Americans and the Chinese and the Iranians, there's something else entirely at play here, and that's much more about Saudi Arabia. So Mohammed bin Salman is trying to rebuild his country and develop it economically, and to diversify away from a dependence on oil and gas, petrochemicals. That's the vision, what he calls Vision 2030. In order to do that, I think he's realized that he needs stability, peace, and no rockets, missiles, and drones being shot at his territory, because you can't attract foreign direct investment. You can't have stability if your oil installations, oil fields, and so on are under attack. So he's an out-of-the-box thinker. He thought, the Americans didn't come to my rescue in September 2019 when the Iranians attacked Abqaiq, which is a major oil facility in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. What am I going to do? How am I going to try to contain the Iranians? He has no illusions about the nature of the Iranian regime, that it's a regime that wants to export revolution, use non-state actors, and so on. So he decided he would turn to the Chinese. The Chinese have certain advantages over the Americans. First, they have a very good and close relationship with the Iranians. They buy oil from Iran. They're the major trading partner of Iran. And they happen to also be the major trade partner of Saudi Arabia. So he asked President Xi to see if it's possible to come to an agreement with the Iranians. And the agreement has an official sort of set of statements, but there's also a secret sort of codicil to the agreement. And the official bits are about reopening embassies and consulates and giving Hajj visas to Iranians. The unofficial parts of the agreement have to do with Yemen. Yemen is the principal source of strategic instability for the kingdom. So Mohammed bin Salman wants to end the war in Yemen. This is something he's been wanting to do for several years now. And the Iranians have tremendous influence over the Houthis, who are this rebel group in Yemen. In return for the Iranians helping out with stabilizing Yemen and ending the war there, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudis, are going to tone down the criticism of an international Persian television station based out of London called Iran International, that has proven extremely effective in mobilizing Iranians against the regime, because it's beamed into Iran and it's very widely watched. In addition to that, the Saudis are willing to open up negotiations with the Syrians and bring them back into the Arab League. This, by the way, the bit about Syria was happening well before the agreement was hatched and concluded with the Iranians. So the Saudis have gone from a forward-leaning, fairly aggressive set of policies to a policy of zero problems in the region, especially with Iran, and largely with the view of wanting to rebuild their country and to diversify their economy and to get on with the vision 2030. And so I think Mohammed bin Salman has realized that he can have much more influence, and he can get on with the projects that he wants to get on with if he contains Iran and has a detente with Iran. This is not a rapprochement. This is, the Saudis and the Iranians are not going to become best friends anytime soon, but it's a detente that's being kind of overseen, or it's under the aegis of China.
So would I be correct in assuming that to some degree you could attribute this shift to the US's perceived failure as a guarantor of security, almost?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the United States has no influence over Iran. And in fact, um, you know, the stated goal of the Iranian regime is to expel the United States from the Persian Gulf and from the Middle East. I mean, that's a clear stated goal of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Also, from the Saudi perspective, the Americans have, you know, engaged in one blunder after another. The Iraq invasion handed Iraq to the Iranians. Um, the Americans have not been able to contain Iran. In fact, under the Obama administration, after the nuclear deal was concluded, it's known by its acronym JCPOA, the Obama administration gave Iran a tremendous amount of money. These were funds that were under sanctions and were held up. That money has, if you look at what Iran did after it received this money in 2015, it became much more aggressive around the region. It started spreading a lot of money to the non-state actors, groups like Hezbollah, Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, and so on. So from the Saudi perspective, the Americans have been a major source of instability rather than stability. And so if you're interested in stability because you need to have it for your own domestic purposes, you have to look to other ways of guaranteeing it. One is to build your own resources, your own military, which is something the Saudis are engaged in, but so is the UAE. The other is to try to see if there's another international actor that can help stabilize things. I personally think, in general, just in terms of IR theory, if you like, that a unipolar world with one power being too powerful, what the French call a hyperpower, is a very unstable world. The United States, as a single superpower, behaved in ways that were irresponsible, and that moving towards a multipolar world where you have China and possibly others is a more stable state of affairs, because it constrains any one of the superpowers from behaving irresponsibly. And I think the Saudis feel the same. The other point about China that needs to be mentioned with respect to the Persian Gulf, which is where 50% of the world's proven reserves of oil are to be found, and large reserves of gas as well, some of the largest in the world, is that the Chinese want the same thing the Americans want and the Saudis want in the region. They want stability, and they want security and reliability of energy supplies to the world. So in that respect, when it comes to the Middle East and the Persian Gulf in particular, American and Chinese interests are fairly closely aligned. They're also aligned with India's, by the way, because India also imports considerable amounts of energy from this region. And India, like China, like the United States, don't want to see the Straits of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb Straits to be blocked or to be hindered, and for shipping not to flow freely throughout these maritime waterways.
Yeah, so speaking of stability, the last sort of great, I guess, realignment in a manner of speaking before this was the Abraham Accords, to which
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia was not party to, but I guess it can be inferred that it did have its blessing. So, with
Mm.
regards to I guess for the lack of a better word, a hyphenated American Israeli hostility towards Iran, where would Saudi Arabia, and I guess by extension the rest of the GCC, find itself in that equation?
So if Iran maintains a very hostile, aggressive posture where it uses non-state actors like the Houthis and others to, and itself fires missiles and destabilizes the region. What the Saudis would want and what other GCC countries would want, especially the UAE, would be for the United States and Israel to somehow tame Iran, to constrain Iran, to weaken Iran, okay, from behaving in this way. But at the same time, they don't want to be themselves, that is the GCC countries, do not want themselves to be targets of Iranian counter retaliation or retaliation should the Israelis attack Iran. So the Iranians in the past have made it very clear to the Saudis and to the UAE that should Israel attack them, they would be targets, that the Iranians would attack oil installations, perhaps desalination plants in the Persian Gulf. And that's something that would be disastrous to the Saudis, to the UAE. So one of the ways in which the Saudis have inoculated themselves from a potential Iranian attack or retaliatory attack should Israel attack Iran is to have this deal via the Chinese. Because what the Saudis have done effectively is to tell the Iranians, we have nothing to do with Israel. We have our own agreement. If the Israelis attack you, don't attack us, right? And I think in that respect, this latest deal is a very good thing for the Saudis. It's actually quite clever, a clever kind of chess move, if you like. The Abraham Accords are accords that four countries made with Israel, but largely the price or the benefits of the Abraham Accords have been given to these countries by the United States. So if you look at Morocco, Morocco got recognition of the Western Sahara, which is a contested region in south of Morocco, by the United States. The UAE got major arms deals out of the Abraham Accords. The Sudanese got their regime removed from the sanctions, and lots of money flowed to the Sudan. So the Saudis are not part of this agreement, but they don't disapprove of it, and they have their own relationship with Israel when it comes to defense and intelligence cooperation. So the Saudis are not particularly interested in joining the Abraham Accords immediately, because they don't need to. It's an added headache because Israel is domestically not popular in Saudi Arabia, and it's a card that they would only play if the United States were to give Saudi Arabia some tremendous benefit. And what the Saudis are looking for from the United States, not from Israel, is an ironclad security guarantee should they normalize relations with Israel. And they would want, I think, some nuclear help with nuclear technology and nuclear building their nuclear facilities, of course, officially for power generation, but unofficially probably for ultimately producing a weapon if necessary, should Iran end up with a weapon. So the Saudis are interested in the Abraham Accords in as much as what they can get out of it, and from the United States principally.
On top of that, given many of these changes, Russia is also an arbitrator, particularly as far as Syria is concerned. Has the Saudi view of the Russia-Ukraine war or Saudi policy, has it been consistent? Have we seen any changes since Chinese involvement?
Yeah, so the Saudi view of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and of that war is that it's not our war, right? It's not Saudi Arabia's war. This is the West's war with Russia. Okay, and the Saudis would like to remain neutral, have good relations with both sides. So the importance of the Saudis, don't have any particular love for the Russians, but the importance of Russia for Saudi Arabia is that it's a partner when it comes to the OPEC plus um, uh, group that coordinates oil production. This is a group that was formed in 2016 by Saudi Arabia and Russia as a result of the oil shale revolution in the United States. What's I think often not understood is that there are three big players in the oil field, in the oil market. The United States, that produces all in about 20 million barrels of oil a day, and Russia and Saudi Arabia are the two other junior partners in that triumvirate. The United States is the equivalent of Russia and Saudi Arabia combined. And they were losing market share to the United States because of the shale oil revolution. That is, both Russia and Saudi Arabia were losing market. So they came together to try to protect their market share. And that agreement has, through OPEC Plus, has worked very well. At one point, the Saudis turned against the Russians in March, April of 2020, during the COVID a pandemic, when you had a major drop in demand, and the Saudis insisted on a large cut and the Russians refused, and so the Saudis flooded the market and in fact drove oil prices into negative territory in order to discipline the Russians. So Russia is important for Saudi Arabia when it comes to oil, but it's not a strategic ally, it's not a political ally. And what the Saudis have done is to say to the Ukraine, we'll give you $400 million in humanitarian aid, but we will not regulate our oil production in order to help the United States and the West defeat Russia. That's not something the Saudis are interested in doing. They want a price of oil that's in a band between $80 and $100. That's what they need to build all these projects and to break even fiscally. And so the Saudis have been very clear that they will not use oil as a weapon against the Russians.
Professor Haykel, this has been very insightful. Before we let you go, a final question. There are two schools of thought in India at the moment. The first, which sees China's involvement as contrary to India's interests in West Asia, particularly with the growth of Indo-Saudi relations, etc. The other sees opportunity for India, particularly when it comes to the delicate balancing act we maintain both between the Saudis and the GCC, as well as Iran. And this balancing act was often made more challenging by sanctions. Do you think this will sort of alleviate some of the challenges, or is it only going to get more complicated for India here on?
For India and Iran, or just for India?
Just for India, as far as maintaining a balance between.
So I think that both India and China are major customers of Persian Gulf oil and energy sources. Now that need not be a competition between India and China, but it can become very competitive over these resources. So much of that competition, whether it happens or not, will depend on how quickly both India and China reduce their domestic oil consumption. So as the electrification of India and China takes place through solar and alternative sources of energy and renewable sources of energy, there will be a major decline, and especially also in transportation, as your transportation fleets move away from oil and gas and compressed gas to batteries. You will see a major reduction in both countries' demand for oil. As that reduction happens, the Middle East and its resources will become less and less important. If that reduction doesn't happen, in other words, if the transition takes longer to electrify your transportation and your electricity production, then the Middle East will remain crucially important, and the competition between China and India will become more and more intense. And here today, the Chinese have an advantage in that they're building a naval fleet, they're building force projection capabilities, they have the Belt and Road Initiative. They're farther ahead than India in terms of projecting both soft power and economic power into the region.
Professor Haykel, on behalf of Global Order, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.